Hey everyone, this is a piece by a Rosa Luxemburg scholar named Ottokar Luban. The essay is titled Rosa Luxemburg's Critique of Lenin's Ultra-Centralistic Party Concept and of the Bolshevik Revolution. Here's the abstract. After Rosa Luxemburg's manuscript from 1918 on the Russian Revolution was published in the very early days of 1922, there were, and have continued to be, many discussions on the differences between Luxemburg and Lenin. Luxemburg had a very different position on the character of a socialist proletarian movement and on the role of its leaders in comparison to Lenin, and also in contrast to the bureaucrats of the old Social Democratic Party of Germany. A socialist organization should always place its emphasis on the proletarian masses. The kind of socialism and the route to achieve it should be decided by the proletariat rather than the leadership, whose only purpose is to provide a wide framework of socialist issues and drive forward short, middle, and long-term goals. From these basic democratic ideas, Luxemburg criticizes Lenin's ultra-centralistic party concept. See Rosa Luxemburg's Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy of 1904 and her Credo on the State of Russian Social Democracy published in 1911, and The Practice of the Bolshevik Revolution. See Luxemburg's manuscript, The Russian Revolution. This article will present new research findings based on recently discovered archival materials. It will address the following issues: the attitude of the other Spartacus leaders to the Bolsheviks' revolutionary tactics, Luxemburg's possible change of view after the German November Revolution of 1918, and whether she showed hostility to the Bolsheviks or critical solidarity with the Russian comrades. End of abstract. Here's the essay. In 1922, a heated controversy on Rosa Luxemburg's manuscript, The Russian Revolution, arose in the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, and in the Communist International, KI. Paul Levy, who was a close friend of Luxemburg and since March 1919 the leader of the KPD, publicly criticized the participation of the Central Committee in the March 1921 uprising in central Germany, denouncing it as a putsch since some Russian advisors from the Communist International had urged the action. Already expelled from the KPD in the first days of 1922, Levy published Rosa Luxemburg's then unknown manuscript, The Russian Revolution, and used it as a propaganda weapon against his opponents. On the one hand, Levy emphasized Luxemburg's critical remarks on the Bolshevik policy in 1918. On the other, Luxemburg's old friends Clara Zetkin and Adolf Varsky insisted that Luxemburg had given up her critical position against Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the last weeks of her life between the German November Revolution of 1918 and her death on the 15th of January 1919. After 1922, this discussion continued frequently with many variations, culminating in 1931 with Stalin's condemnation of Luxemburg and her followers as semi-Mensheviks. After Stalin's death in 1953, this negative attitude was slowly smoothed down in the European communist countries, mainly in East Germany, particularly in the 1960s and more so in the 1970s, while in Western Europe, countries Luxemburg was sometimes discriminated against as a Bolshevik communist and sometimes used as a weapon of propaganda against the practiced state communism. Now that the Cold War is over and most relevant archives of the former communist states are open to scholars, we have, on a basis of rich new and old materials, the chance to collect, check, and evaluate the facts of Rosa Luxemburg's opinion concerning Lenin's concept of a socialist party and a revolutionary mass movement. Oh yeah, I forgot to say, this piece is from 2012. Oh man, sorry. I could feel that sneeze coming on. I was like, when's it happening? When's it happening? I have the flu while I'm reading this, so I'm gonna have to deal with that. Sorry, friends. Quote, Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy, end quote, 1904, and Credo, On the State of Russian Social Democracy, 1911. I said the quote part because, essays, it's a hard thing. I've mentioned this before, but it's a hard thing to read out loud. Essay titles, because they're in parentheses, and it's like, and then you start reading them like they're a quote, and it's like, oh, that sounds weird. But, Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy, 1904, and Credo, On the State of Russian Social Democracy, 1911. Already in her 1904 essay, Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy, Luxemburg makes clear the fundamental difference between her basic democratic position and Lenin's ultra-centralistic party concept. She sharply criticizes Lenin's notion that, quote, the Central Committee emerges as the real active nucleus of the party. All the remaining organs are merely its executive instruments, end quote. In contrast to this attitude, Luxemburg emphasizes the role of the proletarian masses. Quote, the social democratic movement is the first movement in the history of class societies to be premised in its every aspect and its whole development on the organization and the independent direct action of the masses, end quote. For Luxemburg, Lenin's ultra-centralistic concept neglects the creativity of the proletarian masses. It is, quote, imbued not with a positive creative spirit, but with the sterile spirit of the night watchman state. Lenin's line of thought is concerned principally with the control of party activity and not with its fertilization, with narrowing and not with broadening, with tying the movement up and not with drawing it together. End quote. Luxemburg concludes in her 1904 essay with a phrase that was often used in political debates from the 1920s until the 1950s, even later by anti-Stalinist socialists, quote, the mistakes that are made by a truly revolutionary workers' movement are, historically speaking, immeasurably more fruitful and more valuable than the infallibility of the best possible Central Committee, end quote. In a more moderate way, she repeats her critique of Lenin's party concept in her long 1911 manuscript with a plea for the unity of the Russian Social Democratic Party, which Rosa Luxemburg's Social Democratic Party of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, R.S.D.L.P, the Bolsheviks, several Menshevik groups, the Trotsky partisans, the Jewish Bund, and some more socialist groups belong to. She characterized Lenin's inter-party policy as the, quote, inclination to resolve problems and difficulties in the development of the Russian party mechanistically, with fists and knives, end quote, excluding the inter-party opponents without discussion. In contrast to Lenin's emphasis on organizational solutions, Rosa Luxemburg favors the political discussion on tactical and strategic socialist issues and goals as a necessary clarifying process. On the one hand, Luxemburg sees a, quote, significant gulf, end quote, separating her party, the R.S.D.L.P, from the Mensheviks. On the other, she repeats that, as in 1904 and again in the Russian Revolution of 1905/1906, her party is, quote, in serious opposition to the Bolshevik line, ... against the organizational centralism of Lenin and his friends, because they wanted to secure a revolutionary direction for the proletarian movement by swaddling the party, in a purely mechanistic fashion, with an intellectual dictator from the Central Party executive, end quote. The 1911 repetition of her critical remarks from 1904 against Lenin's position proves that for Luxemburg, the differences with the Bolsheviks on the role of the Socialist Party and the proletarian masses were not part of an occasional dispute but a fundamental matter. The Mass Strike, the Political Party, and the Trade Unions, published in 1906. Luxemburg's concept of the role of a socialist party in the masses was also in contrast to the bureaucratic attitude of the German Social Democratic Party and of the German unions, as we can recognize from her booklet, The Mass Strike, the Political Party, and the Trade Unions, published at the end of 1906, as conclusions from her personal experience as an activist in the First Russian Revolution of 1905-1906. She confirms the importance of mass actions, especially the mass strike, and defines the essentials for her further political writings and activities. The party leaders should neither wait passively for a revolutionary development nor merely give orders for the start of a mass strike, but they must take over the political leadership in encouraging the readiness of the workers with speeches driving things forward. As the experience of the First Russian Revolution had shown, the spontaneity of the masses played an important role in the rise and decline of a revolutionary development. Luxemburg put the emphasis on the spontaneous action of the masses and on the Socialist Party's forward-driving agitation, not on the organizational party work and on pure orders of the leadership. With this attitude, she was in contrast to the bureaucratic attitude of the German Social Democratic Party and the German unions. And also, concerning the role of the masses in the Socialist Party leadership, to Lenin's ultra-centralistic attitude. The Junius pamphlet, The Crisis in German Social Democracy, published in 1915. Excuse me. Even more significant for her basic democratic conviction are her statements in the Junius pamphlet, or Junius pamphlet, I guess it would be in German. J's or Y's, Written in early 1915 with its convincing and impressive plea for a socialist peace policy. Luxemburg raises the question of whether the Social Democratic Party of Germany should have proclaimed a revolutionary mass strike at the outbreak of war, giving the answer, quote, revolutions are, quote, not made, end quote, and great movements of the people are not produced according to technical recipes that repose in the pockets of the party leaders. Small circles of conspirators may organize a riot for a certain day and a certain hour, can give their small group of supporters the signal to begin. Mass movements in great historical crises cannot be initiated by such primitive measures, ... The existing degree of tension between the classes, the degree of intelligence of the masses, and the degree or ripeness of their spirit of resistance. All these factors, which are incalculable, are premises that cannot be artificially created by any party, ... The great historical hour itself creates the forms that will carry the revolutionary movements to a successful outcome, creates and improvises new weapons, enriches the arsenal of the people unknown and unheard of by the party and its leaders. In this historical situation, the Socialist Party should not give, quote, ridiculous precepts and technical recipes, but a political slogan, clearness concerning the political problems and interests of the proletariat in times of war, end quote. Then, quote, mass action will break out, quote, of its own accord, end quote, at the right time, end quote, end quote. Manuscript, The Russian Revolution, from September/October 1918. This basic democratic orientation was also the starting point for Luxemburg's criticism of the Bolshevik policy in Russia in 1918, written down in her famous manuscript on the Russian Revolution. For Luxemburg, the dictatorship of the proletariat is, quote, the work of the class, and not of a little leading minority in the name of the class. That is, it must proceed step by step out of the active participation of the masses, end quote. She confirms this view, quote, the whole mass of the people must take part of it, bracket, that is the development of a socialist society, end bracket. Otherwise, socialism will be decreed from behind a few official desks by a dozen intellectuals. Public control is indispensably necessary. Otherwise, the exchange of experiences remain only with the closed circles of the officials of the regime. Corruption becomes inevitable, end quote. Therefore, Luxemburg rejects, quote, the use of terror in so wide an extent by the Soviet government, end quote, especially since the Bolshevik politicians developed it as a theoretical system, recommending it to the international proletariat as a socialist model. She also pleads for freedom of press, of free association, AO, and assemblage as essentials for the, quote, rule of the broad mass of the people, end quote. It is evident that Luxemburg's basic democratic arguments go in a straight line from her criticism in the 1904 essay, Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy, in the 1906 Mass Strike pamphlet, and in the 1911 Credo, and in the 1915 Junius pamphlet, to her arguments in the 1918 manuscript on the Russian Revolution. There remain three important questions. 1. Did the other leaders of the, quote, Spartacus group, from November 11th, 1918, named the Spartacus League, that is, the group around Rosa Luxemburg, which later became the Communist Party of Germany, share her criticism on the Bolshevik policy? 2. Did Luxemburg change her critical attitude towards the political practice of the Bolsheviks in the months after having written the Russian Revolution? Did Rosa Luxemburg, after the Russian October Revolution in 1917, show hostility against the Bolsheviks, as is sometimes assumed, or did she practice critical solidarity toward her Russian comrades? It is well known that Clara Zetkin and Franz Mehring publicly defended the Bolsheviks in many essays. Paul Levy opposed Luxemburg's critical view in September and October 1918, while in the 1920s he used Luxemburg's arguments against the communists in Germany and in Moscow. Karl Liebknecht sent a clandestine letter from his place of confinement in the summer of 1918 asking that his critical remarks of the Bolsheviks not to be published. Leo Yogeshis, Luxemburg's personal and political friend since the early 1890s, and an important Spartacus leader during the war, very clearly expressed his differences with the Bolsheviks to a Polish comrade in late November 1918. Keta Dunker, another very engaged, intelligent female Spartacus leader, expresses her disappointment in a letter to her husband, quote, but a system which is only able to keep its power in declaring the terror as a matter of principle, a system in which non-concerned persons are shot as hostages, this cannot survive, end quote. Angelika Balabanova, the secretary of the Left International Socialist Commission, heard the same opinion from other leading Spartacus members during her stay in Berlin in the middle of October 1918. These facts show that Luxemburg's critical attitude towards the Bolsheviks was shared by most members of the Spartacus leadership. The question of Luxemburg's possible change of view. In the already mentioned heated debate in the 1920s, Rosa Luxemburg's old Polish friend and political colleague, Adolf Warski, published a letter he assumed she had sent in December 1918, in which she explains the withdrawal of her objections towards the Bolshevik policy. This fragment of a letter is quoted by Varsky by heart! Exclamation point. While the original text was neither published nor found in the archives. Thus, it cannot be used as a subject of serious scientific research or a proof that Luxemburg changed her mind. However, there is an undated handwritten report by her Polish party comrade, H.W., a founding member of the Communist Party of Poland, who had long talks with Rosa Luxemburg and her Spartacus leaders at the end of November or the beginning of December 1918 in Berlin. He writes, quote, "She emphasizes again the issues separating her, bracket, from the Bolsheviks, end bracket, on the agrarian question, the question of nationalities, and the question of terror," end quote. H.W. I think I'm pronouncing that right. It's H.W.A.L.E.C.K.I. The famous economist whose name is Koleski. It looks like it would be pronounced Kalecki, but every time I've heard anyone actually talk about him in real life, it's Koleski. So I'm going to assume that this guy, whose name starts with a W, the final portion of his name is pronounced the same way. So, Valeski. Most clearly, the Spartacus program shows that Luxemburg kept her old views concerning the majority principle in a socialist democracy with broad active participation of the proletarian masses. She wrote it in early December 1918, and it was accepted as the program of the Communist Party of Germany at the founding conference at the end of December 1918. She rejects any kind of socialist minority government and the practice of suppression and terror. Proletarian terror should be used only as a strictly defensive weapon against counter-revolutionary attacks. Paul Frulich, then a follower of Lenin, protested against these sentences at the founding conference of the KPD because he assumed them to be a hidden criticism of the Bolsheviks. Altogether, we see that Luxemburg maintained her basic democratic thread even in the stormy, hectic weeks of the German Revolution. Hostility to the Bolsheviks or critical solidarity with the Russian comrades. Hostility to the Bolsheviks, Luxemburg was well aware of the most difficult situation in which the Bolsheviks tried to realize socialism. Nevertheless, she saw the necessity to remind them of socialist principles and to criticize their errors. Quote, "And yet, it is impossible to remain completely silent," end quote, as she wrote to her Polish comrade Brotman in September 1918. On the other hand, in the manuscript on the Russian Revolution, she praises the Bolsheviks for the first seizure of power by a socialist party in order to realize socialism, hoping that a successful socialist revolution in Central and Western Europe would correct the wrong developments in Russia. These lines in her manuscript on the Russian Revolution, and later on her appreciation and defense of the Russian revolutionaries and the Bolsheviks in her speech at the KPD founding conference, seem to be honest and show Luxemburg's critical solidarity with the Bolsheviks. On the one hand, she and the whole Spartacus leadership rejected the founding of a communist international in early 1919 because of the lack of real communist mass parties in Central and Western Europe. However, the leaders of the young German Communist Party made every effort to communicate with Lenin. In December 1918, Luxemburg and their leading comrades sent their close follower, Eduard Fuchs, with oral messages to Moscow. This was continued after her death by her comrade Leo Yogishis, sending a letter to Lenin in early February 1919 with a report on the KPD development and a request for further financial help. Judging from all of Luxemburg's writings and letters in 1918, it looks as though Rosa Luxemburg shared Yogish's opinions. opinion, which he expressed in a clandestine letter to Sophie Liebknecht in September 1918, full of criticism of the Bolsheviks. There he characterized the socialist Russia governed by Lenin and the Bolsheviks as a, quote, crippled, yet after all, our child, end quote. Final remarks. Rosa Luxemburg's critique of Lenin's ultra-centralistic party concept in 1904, in 1911, and in 1918 was not an occasional polemic owing to a special political situation, but had its origin in fundamental differences in the means of realizing socialism. Otherwise, Luxemburg recognized that the Bolsheviks were the first party to make a successful attempt at a socialist revolution, and she was hoping that the Bolsheviks would change the methods she criticized if the European, or at least the German, revolution were to succeed. Luxemburg and the Bolsheviks had in common the socialist goal, but differed in the method of realization. For Rosa Luxemburg, socialism could not be realized except in a process with complete freedom for all proletarians, without suppression of those who thought differently. This was for her the implicit prerequisite of ensuring the most active and creative participation of the working class in developing a socialist society with equal social, economic, and political rights for all citizens. It is a tragedy for the development of the socialist or communist movement, probably even for European and world history, that Luxemburg's kind of socialism was strongly weakened in 1919 and in the following years by her murder and the murder of many of her comrades by reactionary forces in Germany, and later on also by the Stalinist terror. However, Rosa Luxemburg's ideas of a humanist and liberatory socialism could not be killed. They are still alive. End of essay. This is just a personal thought at the end of this, but when did Rosa Luxemburg die? Like the January of 1919. At this point, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, anarchists worldwide were still in support of the Bolsheviks. I mean, I don't think, even if, Rosa Luxemburg was a die-hard, committed Bolshevik in at the time that she died, and more or less condoned or accepted the necessity of their practices. And this time, the very serious problems that were developing in Russia and the authoritarian consequences of certain bureaucratic authoritarian tendencies within the Bolshevik Party would not, at least in my opinion, this is just my opinion, and the essay's over, so you can just turn it off, is that the worst manifestations of that were very much yet to come. And I think they really, the writing really, is put on the wall in 1921, when the Civil War is over and there's potential for introduction of a more democratic, more egalitarian form of social life to occur within Soviet Russia. But that was fundamentally thwarted in 1921, in early 1921, in my opinion, with the putting down of the Kronstadt Rebellion and the banning of factions, and thus the marginalizing and outlawing of the workers' opposition within the Bolshevik Party itself, represented by Shliapnikov and Kollontai. Obviously, there were factions of the Bolshevik Party that were marginalized before, but that was really like, the banning of the factions. I was like, that's the end of any hopeful emancipatory democratic socialism taking shape in Soviet Russia. But that's just my opinion. Basically, all that's to say is that it's demonstrated that Rosa Luxemburg had not superficial criticisms of Bolshevik practice, but very serious criticisms of Bolshevik practice that were not just, heat of the moment, flourishes of outrage. But even if that wasn't the case, even if it wasn't the case, even if it, even if, as people like Clara Zetkin and other people said that she changed her mind before the 2 months before she died, um, that that wouldn't really say too much in favor of the Bolsheviks, because the evidence, um, the historical occurrences that happened in early Soviet Russia in the early 1920s happened after she died. And I don't even believe that, I think anarchists were viewed very positively, viewed the revolution in Russia extremely positively until, much, at least a couple years after Rosa Luxemburg died. So if there was confusion, um, or, criticisms taking a back seat to critical solidarity, um, that it really wouldn't say very much. At least not at this point in time. But those are just my thoughts, thinking out loud. Maybe I'm full of shit, but if you think I'm full of shit, just say so. It's a free country.